Brar is a local entrepreneur who has been involved in one form of lending or another for over 20 years. He is a husband and father and has been very active in the freedom movement. He is also a friend of mine and calls this church home. He has a great sense of humor. He is some serious eye candy. But just trying to like him for his ideas, not his good looks. And he is quite fearless when it comes to speaking his mind. Please help me welcome my friend, Cam Brar.
I'm just going to add on to what Drea said. You know where it says it takes a village to raise a child? Unfortunately, today it's a village of idiots. All right, so a couple of the questions I get asked quite frequently by a lot of people is, how did we get here so quickly? And how do we get out of this so quickly? So I'm hoping by the time I'm done, you're going to get an appreciation of how we got here and the fact that it's going to be arduous work to get out of here. Marxism is the fundamental operating principle of society. So I'm going to give you kind of the definition first, because a lot of people talk about it. So Marxism is defined as the fundamental operating principle of society is in fact economic class and deterministic of who you are, and we have to seize the means of production of mankind in order to transform society. Today, however, we have gender, racial, environmental Marxists, not just economic ones. Woke, I'll give you a definition of that as well, because there's always a lot of confusion around that. Woke is to call everything bigoted until you control it. Everything is bigotry until you control it. It's a means of power. Okay? So Paulo Freire was born in 1921. He is the godfather of educational Marxism, and we are seeing his philosophy and teachings playing out today. He was a Brazilian educator and a philosopher who was a leading advocate of critical pedagogy. His influential work of pedagogy of the oppressed is generally considered one of the foundational texts of the critical pedagogy movement as a result of his teachings. So Marxists have stolen the education system we live in today in two ways. First off, by purpose, to create educated citizens who can be productive in everyday life so they learn actual facts, they learn how to think, so they learn values and virtues. And so that's how we originally had education defined. The other way they've taken it is getting credentials. So you remember in the old days, you can get a job and be given the credentialing. So now, because they're in charge of the credentialing process, they only want the right folks with the right competency. Competencies they will define. So we will need you to have your medical competency if you want to be a doctor, but nowadays you will also need your diversity, inclusion, and equity competencies as well. Because we control the institution, we get to decide who gets in. This allows them to transform who can fit into their economy and who and how they will earn a living, and the only way they will do it is if they subscribe to their ideology. They also stole the mechanics of education. Paulo's idea was that a true education was a political education, a Marxist indoctrination. So in spite of what you hear that we don't talk about politics in school, we do. Goal being to understand how our lives are lived through the Marxist lens. The teacher becomes a facilitator in the Marxist worldview of whatever is relevant to your life now, which is called cultural relevant teaching. That's the terminology. His idea was that the lesson should be mediator to political knowledge. So for example, you would have a child today doing a math problem. Say they were talking about an example where folks were going skiing, and the resort was 100 kilometers away, and they'd gone 75% of the way there. So the teacher would ask the class, how far have they gone? But instead of just doing that, the teacher would ask now, how many of you have gone skiing before? Show of hands. Some kids would put up their hands, some kids wouldn't. So the teacher would ask, how come you can't go skiing? Seems rather unfair, no? How is it that some people can and can't? Do you think that's a just society we live in? So we can work into this ideology, like that critical race theory and all of these other things, they can work in these things into the topic. So while you might be talking to a school board or a teacher who says, well, there's no set course on these things are introduced into the conversation all the time. Whether it be science, mathematics, you can bring this into every equation. When you question schools about specific courses or classes, right, an ideology like critical race theory or queer theory, they, like I said, will fervently deny it. But as I just showed you, this is how you bring it in. Also, through the training of teachers, not always through textbooks, it's how the teachers are trained today to engage the material using parallaxology, which comes from the Greek and is the theory of human action based on the notion that humans engage in purposeful behavior contrary to reflexive behavior and other unintentional behavior. So, it's also using a lot of third-party materials. So say the class is having a discussion on the rainforest and something comes up about gorillas. Well, the teacher says, let's go to Google. Let's see what Google tells us about gorillas and what's happening to them. Well, what do you think Google's going to do? Which way are the topics going to be swayed? Okay, so that's how it happens. So that whatever Google pulls up is incorporated into the lesson. And like I said, we all know how neutral Google is. So, was how we got here today accidental or planned? Like lobbyists lobby politicians to pass certain laws, special interest groups are lobbying government to incorporate certain teachings and ideologies into the overall curriculum all the time. In 1972, Herbert Marcuse wrote Counter-Revolution Revolt. The big riots of the 60s had failed and America rejected it. It's subjective and Americans spoke out loudly. They didn't want it in their society. So, what's his take on it? Instead of saying, oh well, we tried, Marxism failed, this revolutionary concept's not going to work, he said we need to go into everything. We're not going to go out in the streets anymore and throw a fit, but we're going to go into all the professions. We're going to learn engineering, for example, and take our philosophy with us when we go there. We're going to bring it into the workplace. We're going to infiltrate education at every level. So this started, like I said, in the 70s. In 2015, there was a book written by an Isaac Gottesman, a Marxist Iowa State professor of education, and he wrote a book called A Critical Turn in Education. It's a historical look at how education was transformed. In the first sentence of that book, it asks, where did all the 60s radicals go? Not to the religious cults, not to yuppiedom, but to the classrooms of our nations and our cities and everywhere else. What they call this in the Marxist theory is the problem of reproduction, which doesn't have anything to obviously do with reproduction, but their own insidious reproduction of their ideology. Remember, they need people to be participants in this. So they see that society reproduces itself through their institutions, and in particular, education. So, if a Marxist can take over the schools and build the schools out and fundamentally change its purpose, they're succeeding. We're doing that everywhere in schools out here. Remember, the idea of the school is we're going to educate citizens to be productive members of society. Well, that's how we used to think. And they will then go out and get good jobs in our economy, and then the objective is we're going to program kids to reproduce this model in society in the next generation, which is in fact what we need to have a successful society to continue to grow and prosper and bring the blessings of liberty and freedom to our children and their children. But the Marxists had to figure out how to hijack this process, and that was the deliberate program that the educators in the 60s, but more in the 70s and the 80s educators were trying to solve, the problem of reproduction. How do we get people excited about an idea that when we present it on its merits, nobody wants? That's the challenge. So, in the 70s, they basically gave up on it, and in the 80s, they began to realize that they could go in and start capturing teachers' colleges, as it all runs downstream from teachers' colleges. Once you've got the teachers' colleges, you've got the teachers. And once you've got the teachers, you've got the students. And once you've got the students, you've got the next generation of professionals. So this, like I said, has been ongoing for 50 years. It's not like we suddenly got here overnight. This has been a long march through the institutions. It eventually becomes a force multiplier. The virus grows exponentially. All professionals. So you want to go to medical school? You want to be a doctor? How do you do it? You need to go to medical school where they indoctrinate you. You go to your undergrad, they indoctrinate you. You go to high school, they indoctrinate you. You go to elementary school, indoctrination continues. Which means that in 2 generations, your people will take over medicine. And we lived through that. How many doctors spoke out? You'll take over law in a couple of generations. So the lawyers that are defending you, they think totally differently. Imagine being before a judge who's gone through this. Are they going to see the world the way you see it? You'll eventually staff the government bureaucratic state in 2 generations. And as far as politicians, may take a little bit more than 2, but you'll be well on your way. Think World Economic Forum, think our government. Again, this did not happen overnight. Education was and is the key to taking over everything. That's why the Marxists focus relentless effort into capturing your kids. You know, and so we sit here and we think to ourselves that somehow if we get a teacher replaced, that it's going to suddenly change things. It's not. We've got a whole system to have to undo. It starts right from the foundation of when you've got your kids at home and starting with educating them yourselves. Because as I've mentioned, all levels of higher education, basic education, are designed with the Marxist ideology in play. It's to get your kids to think in a totally different manner. So again, like everybody has previously said to me, whether you're aunts, uncles, grandparents, whether you have kids in the system or anything else, it takes all of us collectively to be paying attention and helping them understand the world around them and making sure that when they get home and you ask them, well, how was your day? And they just say, fine, it doesn't end there. You have to unpack that and say, well, what does that mean? What did you do? What did you learn? Because I can guarantee you that that's the number one thing you have to focus on. And if I had any advice for a parent, I would say, eat meals together. That's the number one thing you can do with your kids. I can't think of how many evenings, I can probably count on both my hands how many days I didn't have meals with my kids for dinner. That was it. That was our round table. That was our discussion. That was where we engaged. And don't be afraid to challenge your kids and have those hard discussions. I'm from India. Indian parents are the most obtrusive parents in your life. But they know better because you're an idiot. When you're 13, 15, 18, I've met some 40-year-old morons. So it's the same way. So you have to be firm. Let them have their back and forth because iron sharpens iron. And you have to realize that the people that are doing and teaching them today, their agenda is polar opposite to you. It's not to have a better society, it's to have a society in how they envision it. Anyway, thank you.